Good morning, everybody. Welcome to ITIF. We have a nice crowd here today, and welcome to those of you who are joining us online. I sort of feel like an airline pilot. I know you have many other opportunities for sessions, and now that Congress is actually holding hearings again, so thanks. You'll be glad you came. An excellent choice, and I'll tell you why in a minute. My name is David Hart. I run the Clean Energy Innovation Policy Program here at ITIF, and I also teach at the Schar School at George Mason. ITIF is a think tank. That means it's a nonpartisan, nonprofit research organization that focuses on science and technology policy issues, and clean energy innovation is one of several areas that we focus on. All right, so why was this a good choice? Well, this is a great report. The title is The Clean Energy Dividend, Military Investment in Energy Technology and What It Means for Civilian Energy Innovation. And I've been looking forward to this day for quite a while. Since we first started working with Dorothy and Jeff, I've learned so much in the process of interacting with them and now reading the final report, and I'm sure that you will as well as you hear from them and have a chance to drill down deeper by reading the report. You couldn't be in more capable hands. Both Dorothy and Jeff have deep knowledge of the Department of Defense as well as clean energy innovation. And we also have a couple of excellent commentators and folks that will join in the discussion. So let me just introduce the panel, tell you how we're going to run the program, and then we'll dive into it. So Dorothy Robine is a member of ITIF's board, and she's a policy expert who works currently in the areas of transportation, energy, and telecom. She served in the Obama administration as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Installations and Environment, and also as the Commissioner of Public Buildings at the General Services Administration. Jeff Markesy has spent more than 20 years in leadership roles in research, technology, development, and policy aimed at making DoD a more sustainable and effective organization, and he currently serves as Senior Research Advisor to the DOE's National Renewable Energy Lab, NREL, out in Golden, Colorado. So they're the report authors, and they're going to kick off the session by presenting the highlights of their report. Then we'll hear from a couple of commentators. Immediately to Jeff's left is Connor Prohaska. He has been, for 4 months, 5 months? 3 months. He's the Chief Commercialization Officer at the Department of Energy. Yeah, he's getting older by the day. Chief Commercialization Officer at DOE and the Director of the Office of Technology Transitions there. And prior to moving over to OTT, he was Senior Advisor and Chief of Staff at the Advanced Research Projects Agency Energy, that is RPE, where he was a member of the agency's leadership team. And then batting cleanup is Lee Buchanan. Lee is currently a venture partner at the Paladin Capital Group here in Washington. And prior to that, he worked in a variety of corporate and government roles associated with the defense sector, including serving as Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Research, Development, and Acquisition, which is the most senior research, development, and acquisition job for the Navy and the Marine Corps. And he also was Deputy Director and Acting Director of DARPA, so the counterpart for RPE, I guess. Because usually it's the other way around, but Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. So with that, we'll hear from our presenters. There's a PowerPoint. Those of you who are watching online can follow along with the PowerPoint. We'll try to guide you along as we change the slides. If you're interested in commenting, you can use the hashtag ITIF DoD Energy, and we'll have a little bit of discussion after we hear from Connor and Lee, and then we'll open it up for questions, and we welcome questions from the online audience as well as from folks here in the room. So with no further ado, Dorothy is up. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thanks for giving Jeff and me the opportunity to take on this topic. David called my bluff on this. I have been for a long time. I complained to David that the debate in Washington, D.C. over clean energy innovation is a very DOE centric debate, and that's appropriate, or it's understandable. Let me say that DOE has the mission. It has a $7 billion energy R&D budget, $4.8 billion devoted to clean energy. But that debate ignores DoD, which makes a sizable investment in energy technology to meet its mission needs. And So after repeated refrains of this, David said, "Well, all right, why don't you go do something on this topic? Put your money where your mouth is." So that's how this report came about. We look at three big questions. How much is DoD spending on energy, RDT&E, research, development, test, and evaluation? That's number one. Second, how relevant are these investments for civilian clean energy innovation? And third, how can civilian agencies, particularly the Department of Energy, better leverage DoD's investments? This report, let me stress this is not a critique of what DoD is doing, and we are by no means saying DoD should be taken on climate change as a mission. That's not what this report is about. We simply take what DoD is doing in the RDT&E area as a given and try to analyze how much of that is relevant to clean energy innovation. So it is a report about the Department of Defense and what it is doing. It is not a report for DoD. It's really intended largely for a non-defense audience. This morning, I'll cover the first question, and I'll lay out the framework for looking at the second question, and then Jeff will pick it up from there. Now, the context for DoD's investment in RDT&E. And I'll go through this really quickly. I think we can all stipulate to the first one, energy is an essential enabler for DoD. DoD is the single biggest energy consumer in this country, probably in the world. Energy is essential to everything it does. Second, the other side of that coin, energy is a source of vulnerability. There's nothing new about this. World War II, the end of World War II was delayed because George Patton's Third Army couldn't get enough gasoline. In the Iraq and Afghanistan, these fuel convoys carrying largely fuel and water became the most vulnerable target for insurgent attacks. By some accounts, in some years of our involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, more service members were dying protecting fuel convoys than on the conventional battlefield. So this was a very, very big deal. Fixed installations, military bases face their own threat in the form of a commercial grid that is vulnerable to disruption. The third point that sets the context for this is that DoD technological innovation is what DoD does. They have always viewed innovation as a force multiplier. They are very good at it. I could go on at length about this. Let me just say two things. DoD, unlike any other federal R&D agency, develops technology for its own use. That is unique, and that is key to what makes it so effective. Supply and demand are under one institutional roof. Procurement has buying power. No other federal R&D agency has that policy lever. That's also important. We'll say a fair amount about that. How much is DoD investing? By our calculation, this was pretty straightforward. They are spending, this year, DoD will invest $1.6 billion in RDT&E that is directly related to energy. That does not count things that are indirectly related, like computational fluid dynamics and lots of other things. So direct spending on energy, $1.6 billion. $600 million of this is upstream, S&T, science and technology. That's the activity that is most relevant to the commercial sector. It's the most generic. $800 million is downstream, and a lot of that is accounted for by some very large aircraft propulsion projects, such as the Air Force's adaptive engine. All right, what is driving DoD's investment? What drives DoD to spend $1.6 billion a year? Rather than treating this as a budget exercise, we treated it as an exercise in R&D strategy, if you will. There is a group in the Department of Defense called the Energy and Power Community of Interest, and it consists of, as a small group, it's the energy lead for each of the three services, plus OSD, Office of the Secretary of Defense. Rich Carlin, who is the Navy lead in this community of interest, had hoped to be here this morning, but got called away. This is the group that coordinates DoD's spending, and it's a very conscious, coordinated activity, and it is built around 5 what they call warfighter opportunity areas, and you see them listed there. That those aren't their names for them; they have somewhat more technical names. That's our translation of what they mean. I'm going to go through these really quickly and see if I can do them in about, because I think it helps to see what they're actually grappling with. And so first, soldier power. This is dismounted soldiers, small troop units. These are the people operating in remote areas, harsh conditions, the ones that suffer most of the casualties. They carry packs that weigh truly 100 pounds, armor, ammo, water, and an increasing number of electronic devices. Over the last 20 years, soldiers have taken on a huge number of electronic devices. The challenge is to power those devices. They go on standard 72-hour patrols. They have to carry enough batteries to power their devices during those 72 hours. The Army wants to extend the duration of those patrols to 144 hours. So that's the fundamental challenge for soldier power. Base power, contingency bases. These are the bases that support activities outside the United States. Think Camp Leatherneck in Afghanistan. The structures on a contingency base and everything in them is powered by diesel generators that consume JP8, jet fuel propellant, to produce electricity. They're very inefficient. Contingency bases are a poster child for energy inefficiency. This, by the way, is where those fuel convoys, much of what they were carrying is fuel that goes into those diesel generators on contingency bases. So the big challenge is to reduce reliance on liquid fuel to cut down on those convoys, at the same time accommodating the dramatically increasing need for electric power on contingency bases in the form of sensors and protective weaponry, 3D manufacturing, water desalination, that type of thing. All right, number 3, base power for fixed installations. Fixed installations have the luxury of being able to rely on a commercial grid. The big challenge for them is that the grid is vulnerable to disruption from man-made and natural causes, and military bases have to be able to maintain continuous power to their critical loads during an outage of whatever length. The current strategy, reliance on standalone backup generators, tied to every building with a critical load, is a very flawed strategy. So figuring out a way to have that power available during an outage of whatever length. 4th, platform power. Manned platforms, aircraft, ships, ground vehicles. They are the big energy consumers in the military. The amount of, couple things here. The key thing to keep in mind here is that the amount, as with soldiers, as with contingency bases, the amount of electrical equipment that is coming on board these platforms is increasing dramatically. So how do you both power that and propel the vehicle? So DoD is moving toward electrification of its ships and ground vehicles. Aircraft, that's further down. But as a way to more efficiently provide power to all of this onboard electrical equipment, and for a variety of other reasons. So DoD is electrifying its platforms and all of the battlefield, really. And a key challenge here is the power distribution network, getting power to all these different loads, weapons and sensors and computers, the right amount of power at the right time. Autonomous system power, drones, UAVs, but also underwater ground vehicles. Here again, the challenge is a sort of recurring theme. The challenge is to power these things for long duration missions. DoD is embracing electrification of its unmanned systems, just like its manned platforms, particularly the smaller ones. Right now, the lack of good energy technology, energy solutions to maintain long endurance operations is the key impediment to more large scale use of small, particularly UAVs. All right, and then finally, weapon power, directed energy weapons, high energy lasers, railguns, that kind of thing. This was part of Reagan's Star Wars SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. I think the vision now is more of a tactical one rather than these things being futuristic death rays. More tactical use of high energy lasers to zap a swarm of drones, other things like that. Here again, energy is the rub. What stands in the way of what prevents DoD from going forward with this is lack of energy storage systems that provide exceedingly high levels of power that you need to use these things. Also, rapid recharge capability, thermal management, other things. We're not going to say too much about this particular one. This seems to be largely a defense unique need. The Navy is testing flywheels that are used on Formula One race cars as part of the solution to get the kind of power that you need, that rapid acceleration. But for the most part, this is sort of defense unique, so we won't say too much about that. All right. That's the first question. How much is DoD spending, and what's it spending it on? What's driving its investment? Second question, how relevant is this for commercial energy innovation? And I'm going to lay out the framework that we used, and then Jeff is going to talk about 4 of our case studies. So what we did was we looked at the... Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I'm going to skip over that. So we identified the 5 key ways in which historically DoD's research, development, and procurement have influenced commercial innovation, and then we identified technologies that clean energy technologies that intersected with each of those pathways. So let me say just a little bit about each pathway and identify the technologies that we looked at, and then Jeff is going to talk about the 4 that I have asterisks next to, which are our case studies. And these will be very familiar to you, these pathways of influence, we call them. So first, investment in foundational science, technology, and engineering. DoD invests $14 billion a year in this. This is that term, science and technology, again. It's very generic. It has a lot of spillover to the commercial sector. Lots of innovation has come out of DoD funding of this type. In the report, we look at advanced composites as an example of a technology with implications for clean energy. There are others we could have looked at, computational fluid dynamics. Second one, DoD pursuit of advanced technologies that have military value before the commercial sector sees their value. This is sort of the classic defense spin-off scenario. So think GPS, think internet. This is This used to be more common than it is now. DoD is willing to pay a higher price for high performance and the commercial sector doesn't embrace these technologies till the cost comes down. In the report, we look at a couple of examples: wireless power transmission. The military wants to keep drones aloft longer. One way is to recharge at a distance of up to 6.8 miles. So they are doing demos as we speak. DARPA and the Army are doing demos of using lasers to recharge drones. And that has some obvious implications for clean energy. Space-based solar, that's another one. Jeff will talk about that as part of our solar case study. Very, very ambitious. And then third, the Air Force's path-breaking adaptive engine, which is an example of what DoD is doing in the propulsion area. It may or may not have a commercial market, although it will undoubtedly have some spillover. Third area, military R&D to leverage and advance commercial technology. This is increasingly important because the commercial sector is larger than the defense sector and more sophisticated in many areas. So DoD tries to leverage that, maybe not as much as they should, but they try to do that to avoid the expense of a defense unique solution and take advantage of the commercial sector prowess. So it's sort of a spin-in scenario or a spin back and forth scenario, because often DoD typically will invest in enhancing or modifying, tailoring that commercial technology to its own needs. Those enhancements are often valuable commercially, and so the commercial developer will adopt them, and so the lead on a technology will go back and forth. So that's why I call it spin back and forth. In the report, we look at solar PV, solar photovoltaics, and energy storage as two examples of this scenario, and Jeff is going to talk about both of those. Fourth one, I'm almost done, provision of military infrastructure and platforms as test bed for commercial technology, and this is DoD has very valuable resources that allow commercial developers to test out their technologies in a real world setting. We look at microgrids and energy technologies for the built environment. Jeff's going to talk about microgrids. And then finally, DoD early adoption and large-scale procurement of new technologies that have not yet penetrated the commercial market. This is a big influence DoD has had historically. Its role as as I mentioned, it often chooses to pay a higher pay for a premium for higher performance, and that is critical because the earliest versions of major innovations often have very high capital and operating costs and limited reliability, and so DoD takes that on, and the scale of the military market is such that it can help innovators come down the learning and cost curves. In the report, we look at wide band gap semiconductors for power electronics. Jeff is going to talk about that. We also look at fuel cells and at very small modular reactors. Okay.
Thank you, Dorothy. So,
Okay. Thanks, Dorothy. So, I want to illustrate with 4 case studies that we looked at in the report many of the points Dorothy just made. And these 4 case studies, which are listed here, all have a significant potential impact on the civilian clean energy revolution. And I think I'll be able to show you that in these examples there are cases which have already had that impact, are having it now, and can potentially have it even more in the future. Now, as Dorothy has also mentioned, not all clean energy technologies are appropriate or have advantages for DoD to work on, and maybe in the discussion we can talk about some of those. But let me first turn to solar energy and PV. Obviously, people know that renewable energy, low-carbon energy is critical for our energy revolution we're hoping for. DoD's needs are not driven by a desire to reduce its carbon footprint. it's driven by its desire to get energy, and it needs high efficiently, lightweight, and flexible PV. It needs this for its soldiers, it needs it for space-based solar, and it needs it for drones, and it needs it for other vehicles as well. Now, DoD is driven by its performance needs, but it's not immune to cost issues. Contrary to the common belief that DoD will pay anything, it's just not true. And so it is conscious about that. And so DoD is really focused on a new class of technologies, which have existed already and been funded often by the Department of Energy, but they're trying to push them to a scale and an affordability that doesn't exist yet. Today in the commercial market, we're in a situation where crystalline silicon dominates. Okay, it's really the classic lock-in technology, and it's been driven by levelized cost of electricity. The only performance parameter DOE really cares about, and many people in the civilian world, is what's it going to cost me to get a kilowatt hour. This is a classic example in which you don't have additional performance attributes. It's very hard for competitors to move into a marketplace. DoD's interest in things like perovskites and gallium arsenide and other 3,4 materials, which are now either too immature or too expensive for the commercial market, but have energy densities and flexibilities qualitatively different than crystalline silicon, will allow a new technology to come in which can really compete with crystalline silicon. So why do you care about that? Okay, the reason is, without another technology emerging for renewable energy, there are many opportunities which will never get satisfied. You'll never have cost-effective PV being used in mobility solutions. You'll never have it used in lightweight structures. Crystalline silicon is not going to be put on a simple hut someplace. It's way too heavy and too brittle. But it's not going to ever get to scale without some initial market which values an attribute different than just cost. DoD's market is large enough to drive the production down the learning curve. There's actually data and detailed economic analysis that shows that, driven by DoD's interest in space-based solar. We could talk about that more later, as well as its interest in other more terrestrial platforms. Another example is energy storage, which I think everyone in the clean energy world knows is a key for many of the advances we look for. As Dorothy's pointed out, energy storage is an essential enabler for so many military missions. The picture up there shows two examples. One is what soldiers wear today to be able to power all the electronics, their comm gear, the night vision goggles, mapping equipment, all sorts of information. And the one on the bottom shows a large stationary storage, which is essential for the fixed installations trying to make their energy security a reality. DoD needs higher energy density, it needs faster recharge rates, and it needs safer batteries than current commercial lithium-ion. Safety is a huge concern in the military environment. It often surprises people. So they're getting shot at. Why do you care about safety? But in fact, you don't want your transports blowing up. Moving lithium-ion batteries on ships to theater is a major difficulty today because of the fear of fire and explosions right now. Now, these characteristics are not something the civilian sector doesn't value. Larger storage, higher energy density, faster recharge rate is actually a big priority for the DOE vehicle program. The drivers for DoD are just more of what the commercial sector wants. But the key again is they will pay for an increased performance today. Now, it's important to remember DoD is not going to be developing its own battery cell manufacturing facilities. So from DoD's perspective, these technologies have to emerge in the civilian sector so they can buy them back, so they can rely on the commercial supply chain. So batteries is an example in which DoD today uses batteries and buys hundreds of thousands of them out of the commercial sector. But because of price points, the commercial sector isn't providing the level of performance DoD needs. So what does DoD do? DoD is investing R&D dollars and collaborating with commercial firms to hope they appear in the commercial sector. And as Dorothy mentioned before, they're not just investing R&D dollars, they represent a huge early commercial market. And in the case of fixed large storage batteries, it's not that they're looking for more performance than the commercial sector. DoD's need for large storage at the military installations is no different than the commercial sector, but they have a different value proposition. Their need for security will allow them or force them to pay a higher price than someone who buys stationary storage batteries for grid services. So again, it's both an interest in pushing technology, using its facilities for demonstrations, and as an early adopter, which can accelerate a market which has commercial needs and desires, but right now is somewhat stuck because of cost issues. Let me turn to a third issue, which is one I've worked on for quite a bit of my career, is microgrids. As Dorothy mentioned, there are two issues which are critical in the bases, both here and abroad. On our fixed bases, we worry about long-term outages for critical missions. And microgrids is a way to try to give you energy security. In our bases, our contingency bases, which aren't tied to the grid, microgrids allows you to operate them more efficiently and also integrate large amounts of renewable energy. So it allows you to reduce the fuel supply, which reduces those caravans of trucks we saw a decade ago going over the mountains into Afghanistan, and allows you to operate longer term without resupply in theater itself. So these are two essential needs for DoD for its bases of the future. What their needs are is completely concurrent with what the commercial sector needs. There's two commercial sectors out there. One is the microgrids for fixed installations have the same technical requirements as a microgrid for a community, a microgrid for a hospital complex, a microgrid for a university campus. The difference is why DoD wants it versus why the civilian sector, but they want the same technology. So this is an example where DoD's ability to take out developing early commercial technology, test it under operational environments, and make the information widely public is a unique role that they can play. It's very rare that you'll see an industry who's being aggressive enough to try a new technology in the real world will then go publish its results quite quickly. In the tactical microgrids, there's a parallel for what's needed in the third world. Small communities who are not tied to a grid could get electricity if these technologies were mature enough. Let me talk to a final case study quickly, and that's wide bandgap semiconductors for power electronics. I think, as most of you probably know, these are viewed as one of the great advances that could really reduce our energy consumption, since almost all modern electricity flows through power electronics today. This is an example that fits two of the pathways that Dorothy talked about. One, this technology would not exist without the fundamental research that DoD funded. The Office of Naval Research and DARPA, for 20 years, funded both the material science, the material engineering, and the material manufacturing of wide bandgap semiconductors. They did it for an interest in power electronics, but primarily for an interest in RF applications, that is radar. And today, wide bandgap semiconductors are used on many operational radars that fly around the world. DOE is now currently taken this technology, which wouldn't be available without past DoD investments, and is pushing it further to reduce its cost for commercial use of power electronics with wide bandgap semiconductors. DoD now can play another role. Having spun off the technology earlier, it can spin it back in as an early consumer of it. Its hybrid electric vehicles in both the Army and its electric ships in the Navy are dependent on these technologies and will be a consumer of the first generation of them in quite large numbers. So those four cases give you a sense, and the report more detail, of how this isn't imaginary. There are real-world opportunities that have taken place, that could take place, and are taking place today. What I want to do now is sort of just wrap up with a few charts on why and how could DoD and DOE collaborate more? And I think one of the first things is to understand a little bit about the different sense in which they invest in technology. There are lots of ways to categorize technology investments. We've done it by talking about fundamental technology, which is sort of the Office of Science in DOE, what's called 6-1 research in DoD, NSF-type research, to technology development, something that happens in the applied offices and RPE and happens in a lot of the DoD labs, to a broader category which we've called translation. And this is an essential step in technology development. It may include demonstrations in the real world, it may include creating prototypes, but it's when you convert a technology concept into a prototype. When you begin to understand its application, you understand its use in the real world. And eventually, after that, you have the stage of early adoption. What you can see in this chart up here is that the scale of investments are very different between the two agencies. One, DOE is predominantly focusing on fundamental and technology development. Well, DOE, and DOD is fundamentally focused on technology translation. That happens when one has a more technology push and one has a more technology pull. Those differences offer an opportunity for a lot of synergy. I don't think one solution answers our clean energy needs. It's by investing both in the later stage and the earlier stages, which we'll actually see transformation of our energy space. So let me just walk through a couple of general recommendations and then wrap up shortly. So first, DOE and DOD have today a limited collaboration. And there are exceptions to that. RPE is probably the biggest exception, who have done a number of things. And they seem to have spiked over the years for different collaborations. But the level of this collaboration, we think, could be beneficial to both agencies and could be significantly increased. One of the reasons is that DoD, because of its late-stage investments in that translational stage in technology development, it could be enormous help to DOE's innovation. If you look at the technology innovation literature, people talk about the learn by doing and the learn by using, okay? Technology doesn't go from a concept in a laboratory to a commercial product. People have to understand how customers interact with it, have to understand how it works in the real world. They have to begin to manufacture it at some scale to drive down the learning curve, to drive down those cost curves. This doesn't happen as a step function. It happens over time. And DoD's ability to fund those and their historic interest in funding those type of activities could be a great partner with the Department of Energy. And related to that is that since DoD is an internal market and one which can serve as an early adopter, it would be helpful, we think, for the Department of Energy to factor DoD's energy needs into their strategic planning and their roadmap. Not to go solve DoD's unique problems, but to look at those problems which are convergent between the defense community and the civilian community and recognize that you're not going to produce a technology and have it leap into large scale, particularly in markets which have huge legacy players in them and are very cost sensitive. The DoD step is one that allows you to make that transition, and so that's one way to do it. The report also has a number of specific recommendations, which I'm not going to walk through and read here, but they cover all the applied offices in the Department of Energy as well as USAID and talk about specific opportunities from battery storage to PV to microgrids. And so we think there are many things that could be started today to try to build this coalition between the Defense Department and the Department of Energy as well. So I just want to summarize and leave time for a panel and discussion to just reiterate a couple of very top-level points that Dorothy and I make in this report. One is, the military relies on energy for everything it does. That is not decreasing, that is increasing, and people talk about the electrification of the battlefield, and this is a real phenomena, and it's just going to grow exponentially over the next years. We think clean energy technologies can benefit from DoD's investment and its procurement. It's those combinations which are so critical. DOE could improve its own innovation pipeline by looking to DoD and doing a partnership there. These opportunities, as I showed on the previous slide, exist in all the applied programs across the Department of Energy and need to be actually initiated right now. So, David, I'll turn it over to you.
Yep, so we're going to reset in about 20 to 30 seconds, and the panel is going to speak from the front. So while we're doing that, let me just encourage everybody to download the report from our site. There's a lot more material in it. These guys have given you the high-level overview, but drill down, and we're happy to engage with you on any of the specifics. This one? Great. So we have a couple of commentators, as I mentioned at the top of the program. And first up is going to be Connor Prohaska, who is the Chief Commercialization Officer at the Department of Energy. So Connor, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, David, and thank you for having me and ITIF for hosting this. And especially thank you, Jeff and Dorothy, when David told me about this paper a few weeks ago, probably, a month ago, right after the new year, and invited me. I was really excited about it. As a Navy vet and former Navy intelligence officer, I can testify to all of this stuff in here is truthful, and a huge need, and almost without a doubt, logistics and supply and power and energy are a huge determinator and when we decide what we can do and what we can't do, no matter how good the intelligence, no matter how good the soldiers, sailors, or airmen. So this is very exciting. Thank you very much. What is the Chief Commercialization Officer at the Department of Energy? I'll start with that because it is a new position for those of you that have been following the department. You'd recall in 2015, Ernie Moniz created the Office of Technology Transitions. That was led by Ellen Williams before she became the RPE director. I don't think she ever actually led the office, but she designed it. Jetta Wong took over that 3-person office, funded out of the secretary's expense account. We now have grown to roughly 20 personnel, and we're continuing to grow. We're on line item now in the Department of Energy's budget, and with that, one of the big interests of the secretary has been how to make this technology transition work. I think upon arriving at DOE, knowing that there was a lot of great efforts going on across the department, actually we've done a quick survey of the department to see how many tech maturation programs exist. Right now we're up to 96. And that number is growing. I was just at National Energy Technology Lab and learned of a new one last Friday. So we have a whole lot of effort going on at the department in a lot of different ways. And what the Chief Commercialization Officer and the Office of Technology Transitions role in that is to more or less try to ride herd to ensure that we're doing the best we can with lessons learned, and also with ensuring that the best practices are followed as we move forward. It's also to be a front door. And real quick, I just want to talk about how we've reestablished the office and how we see our mission. The office is really broken down into 3 parts. The first business line is our policy business line, and that is what policies and practices do we have internally, externally, or even at a statutory level that either enable or prevent tech maturation from the Department of Energy's roughly, you can say any number from $10 to $15 billion of R&D every year. Can't remember what number y'all used, but but with that, that's what the policy business line is for. The second business line is our programs that I just mentioned across the department. We have a number of programs ranging everywhere from RPE's Tech to Market Advisor, and I'm looking at John Jennings right now, who we stole over from DoD to work on this problem exactly over at RPE and lead that effort. And then all the way over to our Tech Commercialization Fund, which is a mandatory tax on all the applied programs to work on tech maturation. And then finally, our third business line, and the one that we're really working on and fits squarely into this mission space and this paper's recommendations, which is our partnership and investments business line. And what that is really our external-facing front door of the department. How do we build relationships to where it's not accidental, that we just have 2 researchers that happen to know that they're both doing work together on the same type of wideband gap work or whatever it may be. Where and how do we make that a little more purposeful? The DoD and DOE actually have a blanket MOU, but with any MOU, specifically between the largest civilian agency and the largest agency in the federal government, it's going to be tough to utilize that. So with that, one of the things that we are currently working on is how do we utilize the DoD's efforts in the last few years, which they're doing their part in the innovation world and in trying to really both spin out, spin in, and be a little more proactive. And that comes from things like DIU-X, which is not X anymore, it's just DIU, MD5, the Army Future Command, OR, Office of Naval Research, obviously, has always been a great partner, as was mentioned earlier, across the Department of Energy. But with that, they're reaching out with their hand, and we have to reach back. And so right now, there's a number of efforts that we are discussing, that we're considering, because it's not just how best we can use the Department of Defense as an end customer, which is a win. And to that point, the 3 wins for the Office of Technology Transition are when we get individuals, agencies, companies, whatever it may be, to use our people, to use our technology, and to use our facilities that we have across the complex. And that's really what we're trying. And the 4th one that kind of overlays that is how do we reduce barriers to tech maturation. So with that, the Department of Defense is really leaning in, and we want to make sure that we are being a helpful partner in that exact world. But as I said at the very beginning, we want to make it a little less accidental, more purposeful. I don't think a blanket DOD, DOE, MOU is going to be the answer to this question. I think it's going to have to be more specific, and we're working through with some of the entities I just named to work on how best we can do that so that they are aware of what we're doing, our policies fit, they have access to what we're doing, and vice versa, right? Because spending some of their stuff back in to be solved, have problems being solved within our national labs is maximizing the taxpayers' dollar when it comes to those facilities. And then finally, we just overall need to promote it so that at the end of the day, we talk about a lot of these things on how they end up in the civilian sector, but they don't do that just if we keep it between DOE and DOE. And that's a little bit of an extra portion here. This paper talks a lot about how we connect the two to move things down the research scale and the development scale. But at some point, we also have to make sure that we're shouting it from the rooftops so that the civilian world understands that and can come in and take it and run with it. So I'll leave that with the introduction, and thank you for having me again.
Thank you very much, Connor. Then our last presenter on the panel is Lee Buchanan.
I would like to thank you all for having me here. Is this on, by the way?
If you get too close, you're too close,
Yeah,
or
right.
too far.
I would also like to thank Rich Carlin for not coming. I tried to get from Dorothy exactly how many people she asked between him and I, and she refused to say, but I'm happy to be here nevertheless. The report and the previous comments have done a terrific job of explaining the what and the why, the opportunity and the motivation. And so I can't say much to embellish on that, especially I'm not a policy guy, I'm a techno nerd. But I would like to spend a few minutes talking about the paper that has not been written that I hope to see soon that talks about how. Because the how, to me, is every bit as important, if not more important, than the what or the why. I have spent my entire career trying to take technology once developed and put it into products, whether it's DoD or commercial life, and I will tell you it is not easy, and it is not efficient, and it's not particularly fun in many cases. Why is that? Well, collaboration, a word we use often, tech transfer, maybe transition, it's a body contact sport. It is not a handoff baton. It is a bunch of people working together towards a common purpose that often come from an uncommon culture. And the matching of those cultures is the hard part. DoD has a culture of working to requirements, working to a set of customers that it knows and it works well with often. The requirements are often, most often are achievable, otherwise they wouldn't be requirements, which means that the DoD seldom, not never, but seldom requires things that do not exist. There's little room for vision there, so it's very much a work to a requirement, satisfy that requirement, and then hand it over. DOE, on the other hand, largely defines its own mission. So it is able to do things for which there is no stated requirement, which often requires vision, and that means that the two the two cultures are often in conflict. Industry, on the third hand, works to not necessarily requirements or a vision, but to something that can sell. It's very much economically driven. So you have a situation where you are asking for collaboration in which there may be a perfectly defined objective. The four areas that you've already heard about are excellent examples. But the collaboration environment, the cultures don't fit. And that requires management and a process that is not always found in either the DoD or the DOE. There are examples of where it works. The Army has a battery program that it does with industry, and it's been reasonably successful. I will take a little bit of issue with Jeffrey's statement that the department is, well, I will agree that the Department of Defense is not driven by lowering its footprint. But sometimes it may seem as though they are. For instance, we spent a great deal of time in the run-up to the Gulf War at DARPA working on batteries, big batteries that would power tanks. Why would we do such a thing? Well, because a tank spends most of its life in something called defilade. It piles up a bunch of dirt and hides behind the dirt so that when the bad guys come, it can pop up. But the tank has to have electricity all the time, so it runs its engine. As it runs its engine, its exhaust rises up over the defilade and is detectable by a number of means. So you're out showing your position even though you're in defilade. So the Army and the Marine Corps were very interested in coming up with batteries that could power the tank. A big thing, by the way, 85 tons in propulsion without any emissions. Spent a lot of time on that. Not recently because the bad guys haven't been that clever yet, but they will be. The second thing is that the batteries that are used by foot soldiers, people that are walking around, if they are of the chemistries that were described, get hot. Fuel cells get even hotter. And if you're in the battlefield and you have infrared goggles, you can see all the good guys as well as you can in daylight because the batteries glow. Bad thing. So the Department of Defense was very interested in inventing a kind of battery, hasn't worked yet, that is cool, room temperature, so that it can't be seen. All of these reduce the carbon footprint, but not for the reasons that normally you would imagine, but very often those interests coincide in ways that you wouldn't expect. So with a different culture, what I've found is that when you get industry in collaboration with the DoD, you have a clash of cultures that's already very difficult. If you have the government, two agencies together, DoD and DOE, that's even more difficult because the cultures are in much more in conflict, and the objectives are harder to put. If you were to have DoD, DOE, and industry together, that's almost impossible. In a previous life, I was trained as a physicist, and we know that there is an exact solution to a one-body problem. There is an approximate solution to a two-body problem, but there is no solution to a three-body problem, and that's what we're assuming can happen. It takes a lot of work. I can't get move from this topic without mentioning that the Hill, Congress, and the policymakers make a huge influence in collaborations when they happen. It used to be that industrial policy, that is, government teaming up with industry, was regarded as industrial policy and therefore evil at its onset. That waxes and wanes. We are in a time when it may not be as serious as it once was, but it probably will go back that way. Second of all, I've experienced, and this goes in cycles as well, Congress is very often in making sure that DOE does not pay for anything that DOD should be doing and vice versa. They like to see a separation of appropriations because they don't want to fund things without knowing what the outcome is going to be or whether that money, the public money, is being spent towards the purpose for which it's appropriated. You can imagine that kind of policy doesn't work well to fund a collaborative process in which the objectives are in common, but the tactics may not be. So I've tried to paint this as a very difficult picture. It is not impossible. There are success stories. John Jennings is one of those. He has survived. John, can you stand up? I just want to let them. I just want to let them see that you can stand. even after the punishment that you've been through, John and I have been in the trenches for a very long time. He more than I. So there is an answer, but it is not so simple as to label collaboration as the be all and end all without some really hard work being done. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Lee. Dorothy or Jeff, I don't know if you have any thoughts you want to share straight off?
Yeah, just what, actually appreciate both your comments. And I think the three-body problem is a good analogy. But in my experience, there's a potential to use industry's singular focus on a bottom line in their business survival to be the glue between different agencies. And so, in some sense, I've seen in previous examples in which tech transfer and the transitions can work when the communication sometimes isn't director to directorate or agency to agency, but agency to industry, industry back to agency, and it goes through that pipeline. But I think your point that industry is critical in this partnership is right on.
Let me respond to Lee. 'Cause I think it's not collaboration for the sake of collaboration. And I know that's not what you're saying, but we have all been part of conferences where people beat up on DOE for not being more successful at commercializing its technology, and it treats technology transfer as this process. You develop the technology and then you figure out how to get it out of there, as opposed to building in the demand pull into the very process, which is what DoD does. So you have a culture of technology push with DOE and DoD demand pull. Those are complementary. Those are highly, highly complementary. Yes, collaboration is hard, but I think for two federal agencies with complementary missions, so I dealt with the Building Technologies Office as one example, and I would say to Roland Rizzer, who was running it then, why don't you view military installations as the last stop in the process when you fund a new building technology? So you, instead of giving you a report, the last stop is a demonstration on a military base. And that just makes so much sense. I think it was a funding issue largely. It came down to, Jeff did the negotiations, it came down to who would pay for it, but that's a very concrete example. We did it very successfully with Sunshot, the solar initiative, where we demonstrated on at Fort Irwin a particular solar PV technology that DOE awarded a big chunk of money to. I actually announced it with Steve Chu. It was a big deal, and it worked extremely well. So, I think it's in DOD's role as a test bed that there is the closest fit. The labs the DOE labs tend to see DoD as a checkbook as opposed to a valuable test bed, not just bases, but also military platforms, and as a source of demand pull. And DOE, for its part, sees the labs as being, well, never mind.
Yeah. So let me. You're right. What I had hoped to emphasize was the fact that, and your point is exactly that. When you do these collaborations, you want to do them as early as you possibly can.
Yes.
The notion of, and this takes place in lots of universities, I'm going to have a bunch of professors, no disrespect to professors, a bunch of professors doing R&D, at the end of which I will turn it over to the commercialization office and they will find the best place for this, simply doesn't work. It just doesn't work, because inevitably, unless it's by total chance, the technology has been developed in a direction that doesn't suit any readily available and visible market. Right? So you need to get, as early as possible, you need to get all the players involved, and that will be industry or the two agencies. Inevitably, the technology will diverge in its character towards one or the other. It will never stay in the middle of the road, and you need to be aware of that so that you can take action. Second thing is, the collaboration needs to be funded and managed in a way such that if things go south, the technology doesn't work, the demand is not there, the collaboration stops. The tendency among many collaborations is to persevere even in the face of lack of success, because I got to keep this thing going. Success is persistence, but the ideal collaboration is one in which it spontaneously, disengages because it's no longer needed or it's been overcome by something else. So there's a set of best practices that have accrued from many, many failures and a few successes that ought to be tabulated, your next study, in a way that it could be a useful handbook to the way these things can be put on. I will tell you from my own experience, industry is no expert. I see as many poor collaborations in industry as I do in government. There is no magic potion here. There is no set of experts that are unified in their opinion, but there are best practices that can be tabulated.
Just quickly to that, I think your point about the collaboration has to be early, we agree wholeheartedly with, and I think one of the points in the report talks about is you have to factor this in your strategic planning and your road mapping, because those opportunities can't be found late in the game, and they can occasionally, but it's a very ineffective way to do it. And so I think that's really important. And just one other thing, which I'm glad to hear someone else say, the industry is not the Superman in this thing. If you talk to Fortune 500 technology companies and you talk to their R&D headquarters and their product line, the R&D headquarters says, I can never get the product line to consider my technology. I can't get anything out of the line. And the product line says, the R&D guys have no idea what we need. Sounds a lot like what, so these are ubiquitous challenges, not just the government.
Yeah, and please don't hear me trashing my U.S. Navy good guy DOE colleagues here, because you got to start somewhere. And right now there is a body of technology that needs to be exploited. He's doing exactly the right thing. In the future, the culture needs to change, in my view, towards the other.
So I'd like to ping on the future there, and I'm laughing because I had that conversation with a CTO from a major company on Thursday down in Houston, and I thought, if he can't figure it out, how's the federal government going to? But to the culture part that you hit on, Lee, which is that's one of the things that Secretary Perry has been very keen on, and Under Secretary DeBar as well, which is, all right, look, this is, first off, it's not a zero-sum game. The Department of Energy should be doing basic science, basic research across the board that doesn't have an end customer. It's not a. I mean, that is arguably the most important role for the Department of Energy to be doing, is to shoot neutrinos into the ground out of Fermilab and catch them in South Dakota. But there's not a whole lot of customers for that. But with that in mind, that it's not a zero-sum game, we've really focused on, we're not trying to, pervert the research agenda by saying everything has to be commercialized, but it's very clear if you walk around the portfolios of EERE, of our applied offices, and even of our offices of science portfolio, there are opportunities that are not being exploited appropriately. In that same vein, one of the concrete steps that the Secretary has taken recently is in the Performance Enhancement and Measurement Plan, Engagement and Measurement Plan, which is more or less the Department of Energy National Laboratory Report Card. We have added a new metrics which grades and measures how well our national labs, specifically our science labs, NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab, has always done a great job with it and continues to, but how our Office of Science Labs do when it comes to tech transitions and tech maturation and working those problems through. So hopefully that, which has just been implemented this year, is the beginning of kind of changing the overall thought process when it comes to tech commercialization in our national labs, because it has been a backseat priority. And we're not trying to make it the main priority, but it's something that should be considered.
Can I just... to the culture question, one of the things, and I know you need to wrap up.
No, we're going to get some other questions in here. So go ahead.
Just my experience is that not all, but the vast majority of scientists and engineering, all the way to the fundamental bench level stuff, went into it because they wanted to change the world. And so the view that they don't want to see their things commercialized or don't want to see them having impacts, I don't think is true. They don't know how to have it happen, but there is a culture of wanting to see the world change in the research labs, and that gives you a foundation to build upon, and it's often not recognized or exploited enough.
Okay, so we're going to open up for questions. Let me invite folks online to join the conversation with the hashtag ITIF DoD Energy. And let me start with one, which is the extent to which DoD, as a pull or procurement pull on the energy system, could lead to domestic manufacturing capabilities. As we know, in a number of the areas, including some that you've highlighted, the U.S. actually doesn't make these things. Or we have foreign FDI companies that are making them, which may or may not be acceptable. So I'm just curious about that domestication of manufacturing and whether you have thoughts about that.
I'll say something and then turn it over to you. Yeah, I think the DoD cares about domestic manufacturing for different reasons than the White House Office of Science and Technology policy. I mean, they care about it for security reasons, supply chain security. And this is an issue with batteries. If you read Rand's report on portable batteries, it's all about the supply chain foreign. The presence of most batteries come from foreign suppliers. So DoD wideband gap semiconductors, they use the Defense Production Act back a decade or so ago as a way to preserve domestic manufacturing capability of wideband gap semiconductors for radar purposes. And you can look at that in a number of different areas.
Yeah, I mean, this issue of manufacturing in the U.S. versus importing has a lot of different elements to it. I mean, there's political and economic elements, and there's security elements, as Dorothy alluded to. I think the security elements are generally what drives the internal DoD discussion, as opposed to what the discussion you might hear in the White House or on the Hill. In some sense, I personally am skeptical you're going to change the world economic order and all of a sudden lithium-ion cells are not going to be manufactured in the U.S. I just don't see how that happens. But when you introduce new industries, let's say a new flexible high-efficiency PV module, the initial manufacturing, will probably take place in the U.S. The question then is more of an industrial policy question. Does it stay there? And I think so when defense looks at new technologies and their manufacturing base is emerging, there's a higher likelihood that it has a chance to be here, and then the question, does it stay here, arises later. And that's a question, I think, outside the scope of the Defense Department.
Thanks. So in the back I saw a question, yeah.
Hi, Philip Hicks. I'm with Electric Power Research Institute, and I wanted to get your guys' thoughts. There is a collaborative program with DoD and DOE. There's actually two of them, the Strategic Environmental Research Development Program and the Environmental Security Technology Certification Program. DOE, actually, the program manager comes from NREL, if I remember correct, and I know they're heavily engaged. But right now, with only $12 million of funding, there doesn't seem to be a lot of impetus or urgency to increase the development of this kind of organization that evaluates commercial technology from either DoD or DOE at that matter. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, successes, failures of that, and any other thoughts.
Okay.
Well, you targeted that to the right panel here.
For many of you know, but I mean, I ran both programs for 20 years. I actually created one of the programs the first year I went to DoD with the notion that, hey, if we don't test this stuff, how's it going to ever be used? They are good examples of collaboration. And actually, I think on a very not nitty-gritty level, in the management of federal government personnel, how do you make program managers actually work together? There's some lessons learned to that having to do with incentives in people's job descriptions, really nitty-gritty federal personnel management stuff. I think your point is if their funding is declined slightly. That's due to a lot of both internal factors in DoD and congressional support, and I think that's a disappointment. I do think they have an opportunity to be a platform for more collaboration between DoD and DOE for the areas in which they have responsibility.
Yeah, from my vantage point, I oversaw CERTIP and ESTCP, and they're unbelievable programs. I do not think of them as a joint program. I mean, yes, there is DOE representative, also I think an EPA representative on the board of ESTCP, but those are DOD programs. Let me, since you mentioned personnel, I want to just mention something. This didn't make it into our report, but I think it's, you see in DARPA, people come from the services and spend a couple years at DARPA and then go back to the services, and that's very effective. There is a little bit of that between DOD and ARPA-E. There needs to be more of it. And one of the commenters on this paper said it needs to include people in uniform. They were not aware of any of the DoD personnel who've gone to ARPA-E being in uniform. This was a person who wore a uniform, and he said that makes a difference. And it also then falls on DoD to have that be part of the career path, to be rewarded in the career path. It is a stint in DARPA is a positive thing for your career if you're in DoD. DoD needs to make sure that the same is true for personnel assignments to DOE.
Yeah, let me just add one thing. That the incentives are critical, but for example, at NREL, which is where I spend half my time now, we actually are in discussion with the services to have detailees spend a year at the lab. Now, the key will be, is this helpful to their career or damaging their career? And I don't know the answer to that, but there is interest among the military services and at least NREL in having that for obvious reasons of collaboration.
Yeah, I just add that when we had that we did have that conversation very recently, and I think we should re-engage just because we knew that wasn't, and I don't know if RPE at the current size is large enough to have enough people come through to make that a positive thing, but that's really a DOD.
Yeah.
So John's name has been taken in vain, so we'll give him,
Yeah, I'll just comment. We are actually working, I'm with ARPA-E, and we are actually working right now to form a partnership with ESTCP, which I hope will come together very soon. So this idea you have is a good one, I like to think, and we're actually trying to figure out how to do it. So,
thank you.
If you go to ARPA-E's website or you Google ARPA-E and DoD, a couple of videos will come up of projects that thanks to John, DoD and ARPA-E are partnering on. And one of them, it starts off with this guy. He's on assignment to ARPA-E. He's a professor at Colorado State or something, and I've forgotten now the technology, but he starts off saying, DoD is a demanding, data-driven customer, and then he goes on to talk about how phenomenal it has been for him as an ARPA-E program manager to have DoD as the customer. That video, to me, says it all.
Thanks. We have a question down in the front here. If you can wait for the microphone.
You said very little.
Can you just introduce yourself?
I'm Carl Nash. I have no particular credentials.
I'm going to start introducing myself.
You said little or nothing about the implementation of very conventional low-tech energy things, such as green buildings or high-energy efficiency vehicles. And also you said nothing about the recycling of the detritus from energy, whether it be nuclear waste or battery recycling, that kind of thing.
Well, we focused on RDT&E. So by taking that focus on research, we didn't look at those kinds of things. I do think, I mean, the appendix of the report has a section on building energy technologies. This was sort of my baby when I was at DoD, and I think military installations are a phenomenal test bed for next generation technologies for the built environment. But it's just beyond the scope of the report to get into why the Army doesn't have meters in its buildings, things like that. Nuclear, we could talk about nuclear if other people want to, about very small modular reactors.
Great, thanks. Over here in the red tie. The man with the microphone. Oh, sorry. You got the microphone, so you get to do it. Yeah.
Thanks. Thomas Phillips from Battelle. Lee Buchanan, you had mentioned that Congress likes to keep the appropriations between DoD and DOE quite separate, and that harms the collaborative environment. Outside of opening up those funding lines between the two agencies. And while I recognize you can't legislate your way into collaboration, are there ideas, policy-wise or legislative recommendations that could facilitate these collaborations? Thanks.
I'm not a policy guy, so what I see are impediments in the way. Collaboration is not something that will happen spontaneously. It has, I'm very much of a mind. I wish I had it with me. I typically wag a cartoon around Felix Unger, if some of you know that cartoonist. He has a cartoon with two fish bowls, and there's a fish in each bowl, and the one person is talking to the other saying, well, if you want them to mate, you have to get them closer together. and that very much is sort of my impression of, all agencies trying to collaborate. We're each, living in our own fish bowls, and pushing us together won't sort of do the trick. So there has to be, first of all, an recognition that it's a good thing, because people in some of these environments aren't risk takers, at least to their career. There has to be demonstrable initiatives to do these things that people can hold up. So it's not so much a legislative agenda as it is a set of incentives that could be put on the table, which would persist, by the way, that would stimulate people to change their behaviors over a long period of time.
I don't think.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to, I don't think that there's not a desire. We just answer to different people, and they have different specific, and when I say different people, different members of Congress. At the end of the day, that's our responsibility as the executive, is to execute as efficiently and effectively on the dollars that we're given. And we answer to different people, but I think, to the fishbowl example, the conversation we were just having, when people come in, and if we can execute on getting people into our facilities, we've got this immense national, and we're also not discussing in this particular forum the immense amount of effort that the other entire half of the building at the Department of Energy does, which is the NNSA, through our weapons labs. There is immense collaboration, obviously, with the Department of Defense there. But that's a little bit outside the scope of Jeff and Dorothy's paper. But I do think one of the best opportunities that we have right now, without trying to go and make immense difference in the way that things are legislated, is getting people to use our people, our technology, and our facilities.
Yeah, can I just, a couple points to make it clear that I don't think, at least Dorothy or I, and I doubt other people at this table either, are recommending some joint appropriation. I mean, I think that's a wrong path to walk down. I mean, Congress is going to want to keep appropriations clean and separate, and I think they should be. I'm a big believer is that good things happen when you identify pure self-interest as the motivator and find places where they align. So DOE self-interest and DOD self-interest, and I think our paper is trying to make the argument that those self-interests do align. Now you've got to figure out the way to facilitate it. And I think your point, it is, both the use of facilities. In the case of DOE, those are the classic user laboratory facilities. And NREL, there's a very significant one, which I just came from a meeting yesterday about DOD projects spending a lot of time next year there. And the DOD facilities and platforms are an equivalent one, which hasn't been exploited by DOE. But it's not about melding money. I think if you walk down that pathway, you have political problems, and you create what Lee mentioned, you create things that you can't kill when they need to be done.
Yeah, an example I would hold on, and it's a little bit self-serving perhaps, is DARPA. Previously ARPA, then DARPA, then ARPA, but it's a bit of history. The old model of DARPA, the one upon which it was founded, was we're going to go out and find the best people we can possibly find in industry and in academia. We're going to bring them into the agency. We're going to give them a lot of money to do the right thing. We're going to suck their brains dry, and then we're going to kick them out after 4 years. Now, that sounds a little cruel. It sounds a little inefficient. But what happens is that once you get kicked out the other side, once you've been exposed to all of the things that DARPA does, it is inevitable that those technologies get incorporated into whatever entity you find yourself into later. Right, and that was the greatest tech transfer mechanism we had, the people walking out the door. And I would say, I hear the same things going on here. with DOE, but 4 years is about the time that it takes to get somebody up on a step, but not so far up that they become useless when they go back. All right. So as I said before, it's a body contact sport. It is not a baton, and intimacy is the key.
Okay, let's get some other questions. Yeah.
Second lead thing, the power of the DARPA alumni network for technology transfer should never be discounted. It is a huge factor in their success.
Right next to you, Rachel.
Thank you. Mike Imany, retired engineer. A question to the panel, and I appreciate the scoping of the report. I think it's a very appropriate report, and I hope it gets read across the industry and government. So where did cybersecurity research and development fit into the clean energy economy? And do you think it's a sizable investment, or it's if you will, an asterisk in the corner?
I think it's a huge issue. Not for mobility things as much, maybe down the road, but right now for energy in our fixed facilities and, in DoD's cases, bases, and communities' cases, civilian world, because the future of energy is a networked system, right, which opens it up to cybersecurity. I think, and I believe there's a line or two in the report, it's very minor made, but, if DoD is worried about cybersecurity and DOE has a new office, Caesar, for cybersecurity, there are very few real-world platforms to test out cybersecurity that are better than an installation, which has huge concerns. Now, that has a lot of programmatic barriers to make happen, but it does offer a big opportunity for collaboration on cybersecurity for, not all cybersecurity for energy and physical infrastructure.
The DOE, just to put a plug into our new cybersecurity office named Caesar Cybersecurity, Electrical Security, and Emergency Response, led by Assistant Secretary Karen Evans. The Office of Tech Transitions, in our role for Assistant Secretary Evans, is a different role than we play in a lot of different other ways. It's a sector-specific responsibility that we have at the Department of Energy in that world, in the cybersecurity world. Our Tech Transitions mission is almost quite different, that when something comes inbound, she needs to validate it, and she wants it on the system and proliferated as fast as possible to execute on her mission of creating cybersecurity. So it's not this technology development feel within the department as much as we've got to protect, we've got to get it on board, and we've got to use it as fast as possible. So it's a little bit different world than we're going to do early stage. Early stages, we don't need early stage right now. We need stuff on the system. So
let me give you the other side of the story. You heard that I work at a fund, a venture capital fund, Paladin Capital. It's here in town. We had a $300 million fund directed exactly at cybersecurity. That was all that we did in that fund. And what we find is there's a lot more money than there are deals to do, because for the moment, the government is the best source of technology that we have. It turns out that if you're a CEO of a big corporation, cybersecurity is not a profit center. It's a cost. I'm going to minimize cost. I want as little of this as I can to satisfy my board. Not to be secure, but to satisfy my board, and it turns out that's a little bit. So the impetus in cybersecurity technology, the progress, is going to come, for the moment, sorry to say, from the government. And that, so they're doing exactly the right thing.
Thanks. I think we have time for one more.
Hi, I'm Colin McCormick, Valence Strategic. I was at DOE for a while, and I'll start by saying when I was there, I always encouraged people to work closely with DOD. It was a problem because people were not, program managers were not rewarded for that. It wasn't part of their performance management criteria, so it's always it's a core people problem. I want to ask a question briefly about the laboratory system. We've heard about the national labs, how they often that's where the coordination ends up happening. But I'd like to flip that around and ask about the DoD laboratory system, where there's a great deal of energy technology capability. I was just at NRL, great fuel cell work, really interesting. DOE doesn't reach into that laboratory network very much. DOE doesn't look to the DoD labs anywhere near as much as perhaps they should. And I wonder if there's some policy thinking to be done about how to improve the flow of ideas and looking for solutions in that direction. Not just DoD coming to the DOE labs, but DOE looking to the Department of Defense laboratory network for energy technology capability. Love any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and these aren't thoughts; it's just real actions, as I mentioned in my early discussions. When David asked me to come, I realized I need to answer some questions here, so I started conversations 2 months ago. Now, but in reality, we have, as I walked in, I said to David, "This is a very timely panel because just that." Now, once again, part of the motivation to start that discussion was bringing those technologies out of those labs and utilizing our facilities and our labs again. But that doesn't, I don't, that's not doesn't forbid technology going the other way. I believe that we can build that line. Right now the conversation's still going the other way into our national lab system out of the DoD labs, but I don't think that's prohibitive.
Do you want to comment on that? So there is some discussion in the report about fundamental S&T, and that's an important pathway for energy technologies with commercial applications that, the DoD is an enormous funder, and as both Dorothy and Jeff mentioned, much of it isn't categorized as energy. It's broader than that, with spin-offs that are somewhat unpredictable. All right, I want to thank the audience for coming today and encourage you all to read the report, which is on our website. Let me also thank the staff both for their production of the report and production of this event. It was a challenge to pull it together, so Randolph Court, Rachel Trello, Bethany Patterson, Lindsay Bednar, thank you very much. And I think we'll have more coming along these lines. I mean, this report really has just whetted my appetite. And let me thank the panel. Thank you, Connor and Lee, for coming over here today. And with that, we're adjourned. Thank you very much.
It's great to meet you. Oh, good to see you. Absolutely.